If your blood runs orange and blue, this is the pod for you. You're listening to Orange and Blue Bloods, hosted by EJ Stewart and Tommy Beer. Let's get to it, New York.
As we move forward from All-Star Weekend, let's take a look back as we do another edition of This Week in Knicks History. And this is a powder keg, potentially, for some Knicks fans when they talk about this. It was on this day, February 21st, we're recording this podcast on a Tuesday, that the Knicks traded for Carmelo Anthony. New York acquired Carmelo along with Chauncey Billups, Ronaldo Balkman, Anthony Carter, and Sheldon Williams in the trade. It eventually became a 3-team trade that involved some other players that kind of didn't really matter. But he was part of a 3-team trade that involved the Knicks and the Nuggets. The Knicks sent away Wilson Chandler, Danilo Gallinari, Raymond Felton, Timofey Mozgov, a 2014 first-round pick, 2 second-round pick swaps, and a 2 second-round picks and a 2016 first-round pick swap to the Nuggets. And that was the trade between those two teams. The Knicks also sent Eddie Curry and Anthony Randolph to the Minnesota Timberwolves in this deal. So Carmelo comes to the Knicks. A lot of hoopla, hope that the Knicks will maybe get back to championship contention. He doesn't need to lead the Knicks to 3 straight playoff appearances in those first 3 years in New York, but they have just one series win. He finishes as the Knicks' 7th all-time leading scorer. So some success there, but also some lean years. The Knicks spent several years in the lottery in the last several years in New York. Meanwhile, for the Nuggets, they also did not make the playoffs in those 3 years after trading Carmelo Anthony between 2011 and 2013. They made it past the first round. And that was it. They got the first round, and that was it. They never made it past the second round. And then they began a 5-year playoff drought. They would then return to the playoffs in 2019 and make it to the second round of the playoffs for the first time in years, where they were led by point guard Jamal Murray, who was drafted with the 2016 first-round pick that was swapped with the New York Knicks. So with all that being said, if you can follow all that, it was a very complicated trade. Tommy, as we sit here in 2023, 12 years later, were the Knicks right to make the Carmelo Anthony trade?
Man, you talk about something that's been discussed over and over and over again by every Knicks fan from 10 ways from here to Sunday. At the time, I thought it was the right trade. In retrospect, I still think it's the right move. It's one of those, some trades are win-win. Some trades are lopsided for both teams. This is probably, as close to a draw as you're going to get. The Nuggets, have Murray to show for it, but didn't have much postseason success. The Knicks in his final 4 years, I think it's, the Knicks did not qualify for the playoffs. They kind of rushed into signing Melo to a contract extension that wasn't a wise financial decision. But again, for his first 3 years in New York, people forget just how bad the Knicks were prior to Carmelo's arrival. I think, and the people that knocked the trade in retrospect, like they gave up too much. Listen, was Timofey Mozgov and Wilson Chandler and Danilo Gallinari going to lead you to the finals? No. Those guys had respectable careers, but it wasn't like they gave up on a young Isaiah Thomas or some other star.
Giannis, yeah.
So it's the Knicks, that 2013, that 12-13 season, the best season, in recent franchise history. Fortunately, the Knicks are back kind of on the upswing. We obviously had the Julius Randle All NBA, year in the playoff series against the Hawks. Now they're trending towards making the playoffs again with Jalen Brunson and Randle and a good solid young core there. So there's a lot to like, but there was very lean years from the time Marbury left town up until Carmelo Anthony arrived. Then there were a lot of lean years following that. So I think you have to give Carmelo a lot of credit for making the Knicks relevant, at least for a little while. That's something that he earned, that he deserved. There wasn't a lot of bright spots for the Knicks during that stretch, and he provided something for the fans to get excited about.
Okay, so was it the right trade from my position? Yes, but I'll use this with a major caveat or kind of asterisk. It was the right trade because Melo forced them to make the trade. So if people remember what happened during that time, it was very clear that he wanted out of Denver. He did it very respectfully, by the way. But it was clear he wanted out. And essentially, the Nuggets decided, okay, because we don't have much leverage, because Carmelo's gonna have his contract coming up, we kind of have to send him probably wherever he wants to go, so he can sign an extension to that team. So Melo wanted the Knicks, but he wanted New York. So what he did was he essentially flirted with the Nets as well. And the Nets at that is actually kind of ironic. It feels like it was almost deja vu of what happened with Kyrie and KD, because the Nets were looked at as a team who like weren't that good, but like had like nice pieces. Like Brook Lopez at that time, people thought was going to be a young all-star, and they had a package that definitely could get a guy like Carmelo Anthony. So Carmelo, instead of saying, "Look, I'm only going to sign an extension with the Knicks, you need to trade me," essentially said, "I'm willing to go to either team." And that kind of forced, at that time, President Donnie Walsh's hand, and Dolan got into the mix and said, "You got to make this trade," to say, okay, we cannot afford Carmelo Anthony to go to the Nets. At that time, the New Jersey Nets, who were going to move to Brooklyn in a year or two. We can't afford him to go there and sign an extension, and then we had a chance at Melo and we blew it. We can't have that happen. So Melo, the Knicks had to make that trade, and they had to gut their roster essentially. Knicks in that point in the season, they kind of were like the Knicks are this season. They had like one star in Amari Stoudemire and a bunch of young players that were ascending, guys who looked like they had a future. They were playing good team basketball. They had a good thing going. Yep. And that was a super team era where players were taking less money in order to come together and win championships. You saw that obviously with the Miami Heat. Melo, out of all those guys, was the only guy who was like, no, I need to get all the money I possibly can get. I need to sign this extension before this lockout happens, and I will sign it with the Nets if that means I get New York City. And it forced the Knicks' hand. And what happened is he kind of cut his nose despite his face. Like he demanded that he got that trade, and he demanded that he got that money up front. And then the Knicks didn't have the resources to build the team around him. So when people say, well, why couldn't the Knicks build around him? Well, it's Carmelo Anthony's fault. If he would have just either told them, I'm only signing with the Knicks, so trade me to the Knicks, and therefore they could have took assets off the table to make that deal happen, or the Nuggets risk losing him for nothing, or just said, don't trade me anywhere. I'll play the season out and I'll sign in free agency, because the Knicks had cap space as well. People forget. The Knicks then could have used those other assets to then get another third star. Maybe they just maneuver the roster differently so that they had other pieces. Like this Melo era, I think could have gone extremely differently had he just made one decision that would have required him to just not take as much money, and he didn't do that.
What's amazing is like it nowadays, looking back, it doesn't seem like crazy that an all-star got traded. Back at that point, seemed like it was talked about for months ahead of time, and we're still discussing it. And just this past trade deadline, we had 3 8-time all-stars: Durant, Kyrie, and Russell Westbrook traded within like 12 hours, and it was like, business as usual almost, But at that point, it just wasn't that, he was kind of a precursor. He was before it was a fashionable thing to do. That's why it was so controversial, because it's something that we didn't have a lot of, to weigh, should a team give up all these assets for this one player, and what makes, it is. And to your point, had Melo, and even in terms of locking money before the lockout, getting a guaranteed contract, he instead of giving himself a player option for that season in which he was traded, if he had given himself, instead of giving himself the player option, he wanted the guaranteed money.
Yeah, exactly.
If he had just not done that, then he would have been a free agent the summer prior, and it would have been, instead of Bosh as the third banana with Wade and LeBron, it would have been Melo, most likely. Who knows where they would have landed? But all 4 of those guys, including Bosh, would have been free agents. Obviously, they were all drafted for the first 5 picks with Darko. That same summer, they all would have been free agents. And Melo, his career would look so different if he wins, because he would have been alongside LeBron. That means he would have won a championship. And, you talk about great players and legacy, and, obviously Carmelo's careers looked at far differently if he has a title with LeBron.
Yeah, and I think that there's also a chance that, if he goes into that free agency, maybe the Knicks end up signing Melo and Amari in that offseason.
We saw Kyrie bring KD to Brooklyn. KD wasn't going to Brooklyn if it wasn't for Kyrie. So
yeah, and then maybe this becomes this mega super wars that happens in that summer of 2010 that was so anticipated. So a lot of things could have changed with Melo. You're right. The first contract extension he got, he didn't get the 3+1 deal. He wanted the full 5-year deal.
Yes.
Like there were a lot of things that 4+1 and a 5. It was a lot of things that happened with Melo. All of it came down to Melo wanting his money, which
yes.
is understandable. We're in a capitalist society, so I understand it. But I'm just saying, for Melo's basketball legacy,
yes,
and for what his Knicks legacy could have been, as a guy who grew up a Carmelo Anthony fan, was my favorite athlete as a kid. Like, I just think, like, if he would have just told them I'm only going to the Knicks, or just told them I'm going to free agency, I think we're having an entirely different conversation about the Knicks franchise. I think they absolutely compete for championships. I think they go to more than just one series past the first round. I don't know if they win a title, but Melo was that good at that time. He was that good that he could have been the best player on the championship team, and it just didn't happen. And partially, I think, because of him. Last question before we get out of here, because it's a question that gets asked a lot with Melo and his legacy. Do you think his number should be retired at MSG?
Certainly worth the debate. First and foremost, Carmelo Anthony's a first ballot Hall of Famer. No ifs, ands, or buts about it.
Absolutely.
Remember, it's not the NBA Hall of Fame. Even if it was the NBA Hall of Fame, he'd still be a Hall of Famer. But it's the Basketball Hall of Fame. Championship as a freshman at Syracuse, multiple Olympic gold medals, a fantastic scorer, leading scorer on those Olympic teams. And then you factor in his incredible production, especially on the offensive end, as a professional. Carmelo's one of just 5 players in NBA history to average 20 plus points per game in each of his first 14 seasons. The other 4 players in that club: Kareem, Shaq, Michael Jordan, LeBron James. Carmelo wasn't a great scorer. He was one of the greatest scorers in the history of the sport. And to suggest otherwise is just not accurate.
Right.
Should his number get retired? I think it kind of comes down where you fall on the number retiring debate. It's weird, but Carmelo actually played more games as a Nugget than he did as a Knick. His greatest team success was with the Nuggets by far. Denver qualified for the postseason each of the 7 seasons Carmelo was in New York. We know about that run to the Western Conference Finals. All that being said, Carmelo's probably one of the 10 greatest players to ever wear a Knicks uniform, so I don't have a problem with him being retired. I'm probably a little bit of a stickler, or a hard grader, as Mike and the Mad Dog would say, when it comes to retiring numbers.
Yeah.
I probably want a little more postseason success. I'd probably be a little more selective, make it a little bit harder club to get into. But I'd have no problem with the Knicks retiring Melo's number.
Yeah, I mean, the Knicks have had a pretty selective class right now. I mean, you're talking about Walt Frazier, Dick Barnett, Earl Monroe, Dick McGuire, Willis Reed, DeBusschere, Bill Bradley, and Ewing. And Brett Holtzman, who doesn't have a number, but they retired. They announced the 613 wins.
But so many of those are skewed by I shouldn't say skewed, but it's because of those 2 titles. That's why there's
right. I was going to say, what I was going to say was that, like, besides Ewing and McGuire, all those guys have championships, and they all kind of played on the same teams.
Yeah.
So besides that era of Knicks basketball, really no one else has that jersey retired. I have been I'm someone who, again, I criticize Melo's tenure as a Knick a lot. I am pro him getting his number retired. I think when you think of this generation of Knicks basketball, by hook or crook, you think of Carmelo Anthony, and you do think of a lot of greatness that went with that. It wasn't necessarily a lot of wins, but a lot of points, a lot of memorable nights at Madison Square Garden. I think that he shouldn't get it before Bernard King. Bernard King absolutely needs to get his number retired, and it's a shame that he hasn't. Maybe whenever Julius Randle's Knicks career ends, and I'm not saying that it needs to end right now. I'm not trading him on this podcast. I'm just saying whenever Julius Randle moves on, and they have that 30 to retire, they should put up Bernard King. But I think that I'm fine with number 7 going up there in the Knicks rafters. I think that he deserves that. And I thought that he was classy, by the way, to come in and know that he couldn't wear 15, which is retired for Earl Monroe. So I always think it's a fun conversation with the retirements with Carmelo, because he'd be the guy who probably won the least of these guys that would be up there.
Definitely.
And there are some other guys, guys played in the 90s, like the Celtics retired role players' numbers. Like, like John Starks' number is not retired. And some people may say, should he have been retired, considering how much winning they did in the 90s?
Or Oakley,
Or Charles Oakley, right, which over James Dolan's dead body would Charles Oakley's number be retired at Madison Square Garden.
The other thing is, what are they going to do when Jalen Brunson and Julius Randle lead this Knicks team to a dynasty of like 4 titles in 5 years? Then do they have 2 number 30s retired? That's a whole nother predicament they'll be in in about 10 years from now.
Exactly. So shout out to the great Carmelo Anthony again. I saw him when he arrived at the Garden on Christmas, and he got a great standing ovation. I was one of them up cheering for him and giving him a standing ovation. So A crazy time that was in 2011 when Melo was traded to the New York Knicks. But that's going to do it